suppose another reason that I chose this book is because I have an ijaza in it from my wife. No.
بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته everyone. I welcome you all to this introductory session in which inshallah ta'ala Ustadh Moustafa will be talking about the new course which we have just launched, ul-Bayan Intensive. Inshallah ta'ala, it's going to be an exciting session. Towards the end, you will also be able to ask Ustadh questions regarding the course, bi'idhnillahi al-kareem. So, inshallah ta'ala, without further ado, Ustadh Moustafa, تفضل.
نعم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Okay, so I guess we could start with what is Ilm al-Bayan and why it matters. So Ilm al-Bayan is one of three branches of the study of Balagha. And so the study of Balagha, which we can approximately translate as rhetoric, consists of three disciplines. One of them is Ilm al-Bayan, which is the study of figurative speech. Another is Ilm al-Ma'ani, which is basically applied grammar. So all the rules that we learn in grammar, basically taking those and viewing how those affect the intended meaning or the intended impact of speech. And the third is Badia, which is basically both linguistic and semantic embellishment or beautification of language. And so if we think about it for a second, what does balagha actually mean, right? So we said that it's rhetoric, but what does that actually mean? So balagha is basically if we think about the root of the word, it's about how to get language to be effective, to actually reach the other party, to for it. So the root word or the core word that consists of three letters has to do with reaching a particular goal. And so while for example, logic, and just regular language allows us to make arguments and present them, what you'll find in life is that if your goal is, if you spend your life essentially refining your language to be as accurate as it can be, and refining your arguments to be as logical as they can be, you'll find that people will not necessarily appreciate your accuracy either of language or of argumentation, but rather something else is needed entirely. And the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran uses a narrative, and anyone who doesn't have a narrative doesn't have any followers, right? And so the Quran establishes a narrative, and a narrative is basically an application of balagha. It's why we find so many stories in the Quran. It's why we find parables in the Quran. It's why we find comparisons that are both literal and figurative in the Quran, right? And so whoever, and if we look at mainstream media, if we look at entertainment, if we look at public opinion, what we find all around us is that if we were to contextualize this in the context of the trivium of language logic, of basically grammar, logic, and rhetoric, what we find is that in modern times, it's quite interesting. There's been a serious modification of language and grammar, even grammar, literally even grammar, where pronouns are being changed, basic definitions of things like a man and a woman. So what we have is that the first third of the trivium is being intentionally corrupted or ignored. The logic, which is grammar and definitions. The second part of the trivium, which is logic, has also been deemed kind of unnecessary and unrealistic in a postmodern world, because the basic idea is that there is no objective truth, but rather everything is based on narrative and on perspective, and truth is relative. And so what you find is that, for example, a lot of the ideas that are being forced down our throats, a lot of these narratives, whether it's Israel or whether it's gays or what have you, a lot of these ideas are basically ignoring or changing language, ignoring or changing logic, and finally, what you find is that it's just a very, very good narrative, right? And a very good application of rhetoric. Like, what do you mean? For example, what do you mean that that, for example, the Muslims don't allow gays? And this is kind of like formulated under the rubric of human rights and how they're an oppressed group and what have you, or how did the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam marry Sayyidah Aisha when she was so young, and there's an intentional sidelining of logic and language and a focus entirely on narrative. And so one of the greatest applications of balagha, after understanding the Quran and the Sunnah, is to actually apply it at this time where we need it most, in order for Muslims to present their own narrative. Let me give you an example. Back in the 1980s and to a degree in the 90s, what you found in the mosques in North America was not just an turning a blind eye to talk of jihad, but rather an encouragement of jihad, jihadi speeches, in light of the situation in Afghanistan, in the mosques in North America. And we all, would enjoy the talks when people would come by and would say, you have to join the Mujahideen, and this would happen in the mosques in North America. And then all of a sudden, as the Taliban, for example, I'm not making a political statement. I'm just talking about how the narrative changed. When the Taliban stopped fighting the Soviets and started and basically turned against America, or presented America with a threat, the narrative completely changed overnight, and even the ulama bought into this, and so controlling our own narrative through balagha is essential. And what you find with so if you look at the mainstream media, it ignores mainstream media, the major news outlets, and public policy. Things as simple as, don't let girls under the age of 16 get married, or what have you. Any of these Western ideas that are being, pushed in the Muslim world, what you find is they're ignoring logic, they're ignoring grammar and definitions, and they're focusing entirely on the narrative. What you find among students, kind of advanced and smart students of knowledge, is that their knowledge of language is good, their knowledge of logic is good, but in terms of controlling the frame, in terms of frame control, in terms of controlling the narrative, they're utterly at a loss. And so one of the goals of studying balagha, other than understanding the Quran and Sunnah, which should be our primary goal, is to be able to apply it to controlling our own narrative. So that's balagha in general. Now, bayan in particular is the study of figurative language. And what benefit does this have for us? So this allows us, so basically, if we were to look at bayan, we spoke about what balagha means, but let's also talk about what bayan means and why that's so interesting. So Bayan as a word means to make something clearer, or to demonstrate something or to illustrate it, right? And if you think about it, this whole field from soup to nuts, from beginning to end, the entire discipline of Bayan is focused on figurative language. It's focused, I guess you could say, in our current parlance, it's focused on not stating things literally, but rather demonstrating them non-literally, because that is more effective and more apparent than stating them literally. And that's absolutely true. If I can demonstrate that, if I were to say, I've used this example in the past. If I were to, talk about someone like Khabib Nurmagomedov, right? And I were to tell you, he's very strong. He's a very good fighter. You don't want to fight him. He's going to cause you damage. He's ruthless in the ring. If I were to say all of that, right, that's all literally true, right? But if I were to say instead, Khabib is an animal, any man that I say that to, if they're familiar with Khabib, understands exactly what I mean. And everything that I just said previously, I've now said much more effectively in 4 words, pardon me. Khabib is an animal, right? And so oftentimes, in order to present things to the human heart, so you could think about, basically, if we're thinking about the trivium, right? You could think about logic and language as applying to the mind, but the mind doesn't win you converts, right? And this is why almost any effective Dawah strategy does not focus on just facts, but on storytelling, on narrative, on demonstrating, or on causing language to enter into the heart, right? And so when we talk about ilm al-bayan, what we're talking about is representing. If we were to look at what the ulama, how the ulama actually define it, they say it's representing the same idea or representing the same meaning in multiple ways. And so that's the study of ilm al-bayan, right? And as an overview, you could say that ilm al-bayan basically consists of, I mean, there are different ways of categorizing anything, but ilm al-bayan basically consists of 5 areas, right? There are 4 figurative devices that are used in it, and in addition to that, there's a meta discussion of what is haqiqa and majaz. And actually, this study of haqiqa and majaz is useful, and what we could say is, perhaps roughly translated as figurative and or literal truth and figurative language, or literal language and figurative language. It's beneficial in a number of ways. One of them is, first of all, it allows us Muslims to have to understand each other's definitions. So some of the theological differences that that Muslims have had among themselves over the course of history return to, someone saying this isn't a haqiqa and someone else saying it is. And, the word haqiqa isn't used in the Quran or Sunnah, so how one defines it isn't a matter of faith. But at least, at the very least, understanding what this group of ulama meant when they said haqiqa is interesting. And what you'll find is that in Arabic, when we say, for example, when we do a tashbih, a metaphor, that is considered literal. So if I were to say Zaydun Asadun, Zayd is a lion, then according to the scholars of rhetoric of Arabic balagha and bayan in particular, that's haqiqa. Although no one would ever say that Zayd is a lion is literal truth. And so first of all, it reflects what some ulama, what the majority of ulama of balagha meant by haqiqa and majaz, but also it reflects something fundamental about the Arabic language. When you think about, what does it mean that Zaydun Asadun is a haqiqa? right? Because it's obviously not the literal truth. And interesting, Salafis, at least Arab Salafis, are closer, their understanding of haqiqah is actually closer to the modern standard Arabic usage, which is close to the English usage of literal, right? Whereas the classical books of balagha use it in a different manner, and there are at least three differences, which I'll outline in the course, inshallah, between between the term literal and the modern usage, even in Arabic, of the word haqiqa, and between the classical balaghi meaning of haqiqa, right? And this reflects something fundamental about the Arabic language, and that is that we have an underlying assumption here, right? And the underlying assumption is that Zaydun Asadun means Zayd is a lion. But in reality, all you're doing is you're taking two words and you're predicating one to the other, right? You're making one the subject and one. And what is the relationship between the subject and the predicate in a sentence that does not have a verb in Arabic? And what this reflects to us is that there's a lot more going on, and Arabic is a fundamentally different language. Arabic is a fundamentally different language than English, right? So when I say Zaydun Asadun, I did not say Zayd is a lion, right? I predicated lionness or a lion-like state to Zayd, right? I said that Zayd has lionness, but what is the relationship exactly? And even reflecting upon that, and part of that would be a discussion of ma'ani as opposed to bayan. But even if we think about this for a second, Arabic is really the verbless sentences of Arabic are really somewhat of a necessity to describe certain matters, certain fundamental and universal truths. Like if we were to say, for example, if we were to mention what's the ayah from the Quran, لهم أجرهم عند ربهم, right? لهم أجرهم عند ربهم. When? There is no verb in that sentence, right? And so so learning these things causes us to reflect deeper upon what the differences are between Arabic and English, and what predication without a verb, what it means to have a subject and a predicate without a verb in Arabic. It's a timeless statement. No, and so that's basically the idea of ilm al-bayan. No, and so for this particular course, inshallah, we'll be using the text of Fadl Abbas, Asalib al-Bayan, rahimahullah ta'ala. And so why this book in particular? So if you were to look, there are basically, what you find in balagha is you have two sets of texts in balagha, and there's very little in the way of anything that kind of merges them. We have one set of texts which are things like, for example, al-Balagha al-Wadiha and al-Balagha al-Muyassara and other such books. And those books basically give you a simple, practical understanding of balagha and ilm al-bayan. And then you have, on the other hand, books like Talkhis and al-Muftah, which are anything but simple and anything but straightforward, and focus on a worldview that is very much based on an epistemic system that is completely foreign to those who have gone through the modern education system. And so what you have with this book, although the author doesn't attempt to use the classic epistemic model, he doesn't put that front and center in his discussion, rahimahullah, but nonetheless he he predicts what kind of questions a modern student would have, and thus prepares your mind to answer those questions. Like, for example, you could read through, I'll give one practical example. You could read through many books on balagha, both old and new, and come out not understanding why we would consider the harf jar, a genitive particle, a mushtaq, in the specific mabhath, or in the specific mas'ala or issue of isti'ara tab'iyya, right? Harf is a jamid. A harf isn't derived from a verb. What on earth is it doing there? And you could read many books and works of tafsir that give examples of this. Like, for example, in the ayah, فَالْتَقَطَهُ آلُ فِرْعَوْنَ لِيَكُونَ لَهُمْ عدوا وحزنا, and ولا أصلبنهم في جذوع النخل. You could read many examples of this in both the simpler texts and the more advanced texts, and still be at a loss. Why are they referring to this issue? Why are they referring to the huruf as mushtaqqa, as derived from verbs? And you wouldn't get anywhere. And so this idea of understanding fundamental concepts from the mindset of someone who has not studied, the entire classical tradition, who has not studied, classical epistemology, and set theory and what have you, and doesn't understand, Greek philosophy or Persian thought from the Middle Ages. For a modern person to step into those advanced books, they would be at a loss. And for them to read the simpler books, they would have a practical understanding, but they would simply accept things at face value and accept them on faith. Okay, so these scholars said that, and so they must be right. And then as soon as someone comes and says, well, how can you say Zaydun Asadun is a haqiqa, where Zayd is a man, he's not a lion? They would just not be able to respond, right? So this book equips you with, and this course in particular, inshallah, it equips you with the ability to understand the theoretical basis of the theoretical basis of rhetoric, as well as practically appreciate it. None. I suppose another reason that I chose this book is because I have an ijaza in it from my wife. None. None. Did you have? Are there any questions? I'm going to say just a little bit more, and then I'm done. Okay, so one of the methods that I've used in the past when teaching Bayan is I use flowcharts, I use Venn diagrams, and so I use modern methods, modern intellectual modeling to help university students, to help, I suppose I must admit, to help people with a background like my own, which is in formal logic, which is different than classical logic, in formal logic, technical fields, and what have you, appreciate these issues, and I found it to be quite effective. Alhamdulillah. I'm done.
Barakallah fikum, Ustadh. Jazakumullah khaira. Ustadh, there were a couple of questions. So, inshallah ta'ala. The first one is that um, the first one is regarding your methodology in teaching. Now, you're muted,
No.
Ustadh. Now,
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. No. So regarding my methodology, yeah, so that's what I was mentioning. That I basically what I always like to do is to have students think about think about simple matters deeply. So if we think about it, Ilm al-Bayan is actually fairly narrow in breadth, but it's very deep, right? And so I focus on students understanding definitions, testing those definitions, applying them to the Quran, applying them to the Hadith, applying them to poetry, and understanding the theory behind them, as well as I mentioned, presentation using Venn diagrams, if then else type of scenarios and flow charts.
Barakallahu feekum, Ustadh. Another question which some students might have in their minds is that what are the prerequisites for someone who wants to attend this course? What should they
Right.
have already studied now?
So they should know some grammar. They should be comfortable at least understanding i'rab. So obviously that would mean that they should be able to do some i'rab, but they should be comfortable understanding i'rab. There's not a lot of it, but it will come up. They should be comfortable being able to look words up in classical dictionaries. So basically an ability, if they can, read, if they can read the Quran, if they can and understand it, with some effort, read Hadith and understand it with some effort, and bits here and there of poetry, and look up the words they don't understand and what have you, then they should be able to handle the course, inshallah. But definitely reading Arabic well and being able to look words up and being self-driven to research the meanings of words in older dictionaries, and they exist online, and I can share that link, inshallah, during the course or whenever, would be requirements. No, that's pretty much it. A fairly good knowledge of grammar, not a deep knowledge of grammar, as well as being able to understand written classical Arabic.
Assalamu alaikum, Ustadh. Just a quick question. I guess what is it that we should expect to practically get out of like a course in Balagha or ul-Bayan? Is it like to identify types of figurative speech in the Quran and like know a lot of terminology, or is it to be able to identify whether something's literal or figurative? Like I'm trying to understand, like, so Nahu, it's pretty clear you can identify, these are this is actually what's going on. This is how we can translate it, and so on and so forth. But when you get to, figurative speech, like how is that practically applied when you're trying to?
Yeah. So it's not just so one aspect of it would be to understand the Quran in particular, and how certain expressions are used, like for example was'al al-qarya, and to understand that when for example when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, so there would be the simple applications, like you mentioned, like, for example, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا, and you'd understand that this is an isti'ara, that this is a type of metaphor. But in addition to that, in addition to understanding, these basic things, it's important to understand the significance of each of these figurative devices, right? And so, for example, you'll find a misunderstanding among beginning students of Balagha. Scholars of Balagha, for example, will say something like the isti'ara, which is a certain type of metaphor, is stronger than, is ablagh, or is stronger than, for example, the tashbih, which is closer to something like a simile, right? And when they say that, then the question might arise, well, okay, so if the isti'ara is ablagh, has more balagha in it than the tashbih, then why does the Quran even include tashbih, right? And so understanding the rhetorical value of these will also be a focus, right? So understanding that when you, just as an example of the difference between a tashbih and an isti'ara, a tashbih has 4 parts. 2 of those parts have to be there, right? And the other 2 may or may not. But focusing on when those 2 other, for example, whether it's a tashbih baligh or a tashbih mursal, right? Understanding, or sorry, pardon me, yeah, a tashbih baligh or a tashbih mursal, understanding the difference there, and why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala use a comparison operator here and not in this other place, right? And understand because it's not just a question of understanding figurative language or understanding that this language is figurative, but why would you use a tashbih if an isti'ara is ablagh? Well, because the isti'ara, or a special type of kind of like an implicit metaphor, can only be used when there's already a certain amount of intellectual or cultural or religious baggage that you already understand and thus can use as a launching point. And so this idea of thinking that, okay, this is that and this is that, this is a tashbih and this is an isti'ara and this is a kinaya and this is majaz mursal. That's all very good and it's important, but the question is why? Right? In each case, why was this used? And look, and the ulama obviously have done a lot of work on this, but it's the Quran, so it can never be given justice. And so this is an ongoing area of research and advancement. And you even find people in the 20th century, like Sheikh Abdullah Draz, rahimahullah, who came up with new types of balagha that he found in the Quran, or new types of i'jaz that he found in the Quran that other ulama had not occurred to other ulama, and he pulls out the most amazing observations in ayat that you would just read quickly normally and in passing, like a simple ayah about Bani Israel, that you wouldn't think twice about. Think, okay, this is a historical account and it's giving us some moral messages and what have you. But no, he actually pulls out new angles and new facets of balagha, and i'jaz from these ayat. And so thinking about why the Quran is using this particular device here and why it's establishing the narrative in this way is the ultimate goal. And I guess it would also equip you, this course, inshallah, to study or to read works like Al-Alusi's tafsir.
Makes sense. Jazakallah khair.
وإياك.
Barakallah fikum, Ustadh. This one last point I would like to highlight. Inshallah ta'ala, attending a course like this, bi'idhnillah al-kareem, will also, or it's also going to enable the students to access higher level works which cover ul-Bayan. That's correct. So that's one of our goals, right, Ustadh?
Yes, definitely. That's actually what I meant when I said that that this basically equips people, this book with or equips people with a modern education, with what they need in order to be able to read the more advanced books, like Talkhis and Muftah and their commentaries. Naam. As well as works of tafsir, as well as works of tafsir like Al-Alusi. Naam.
Barakallah fikum, Ustadh. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you. Just before we end, do we have any other questions?
For Tafsir Jalalain, are there more is there more balagha studies needed to be able to understand that Jalalain, or is this a good starting?
So okay, so you're asking if balagha will help you understand Tafsir al-Jalalain? Of course it'll help. Is it necessary to understand Tafsir al-Jalalain? You could get through Tafsir al-Jalalain without studying balagha. You wouldn't get as much out of it as you would if you were to study balagha. So this is more along the lines for something like to understand the works of, for example, Zamakhshari, Al-Lubab, التحرير والتنوير, Alusi, and what have you. So, but a note to an interesting note about Tafsir al-Jalalain is that sometimes it's not based on Hafs, which is the most common recitation in the world, because at that time Egypt was the official recitation of Egypt was Abu Amr, right? And so sometimes in Tafsir al-Jalalain, you'll say, what's he talking about? Because it doesn't actually match what you're reciting, because we recite Hafs most of the time. So just a note about Tafsir al-Jalalain.
Got it. Jazakallah.
وإياكم.
Barakallah fikum, Ustadh, for an enlightening session. Alhamdulillah, we got to learn about the importance of ilm al-balagha and the Ustadh's methodology in this course and what the students can expect to get out from it, insha'Allah ta'ala. I would like to thank the Ustadh for his time. Barakallahu fikum. Jazakumullahu khairan kathira. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.